Hey, you. Thank you so very much for buying me a cup of coffee. Woo. Thank you. And I wanted to say that I really appreciate it. I'm trying to expand Out of the Box with Christine to help entrepreneurs and socially conscious folk get their message out to the world, whatever their passion is, whatever their expertise or their business. And so through the shows, I'm hoping to inspire people to get up off of their butts and get out there. So thank you so very much. With this, we want to grow and get more people into podcasting. We want to train more people into vodcasting, which is the video podcasting element. And I just really appreciate your support so very much. And because of your generosity, I want you to know that if you leave your name so that I can identify you, I will thank you on a future episode of Out of the Box with Christine. I'll give you a big shout out. Okay. Thank you so very much. And I'll go enjoy that coffee right now.
Welcome to Out of the Box with Christine, the podcast for conscious entrepreneurs. Are you willing to step into your greatness? Are you ready to shine? Well, get ready, truth seeker. You're in for an amazing ride. And now, here's the host of the show, Christine Blasdale.
Hello, my Out of the Boxers. Welcome back to Out of the Box with Christine. I am your host, Christine Blasdale. And today we're going to have some fun. We're going to be talking about some comedy. We're going to be talking also about following your passion and the importance of listening to that heart inside of you and following your dreams, your passion, no matter what. But today my guest is Art Bell, who is the original founder, actually, of Comedy Central and author of Constant Comedy, How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. And first of all, congratulations on the book and the title, because I totally Christine. Got it.
Thanks. I'm glad you like it. And thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, the podcast, the idea is for conscious entrepreneurs, for people who are creating their own business, who are writing their own books, who are creating their own podcasts, their video channels, maybe becoming coaches and consultants, and the importance about listening to that little voice. And I wanted to jump right in to talk to you and say, have you always been funny? Have you always, when you were a little kid, were you the funny one? And did that funny little sense of humor get you in trouble? And I already know the answer to that, but I'm just setting you up with a good question.
Yeah. I thought I was kind of funny as a kid, and I did get in trouble a lot, got thrown out of class and all that stuff. But more than that, I was, from a very early age, I was a comedy nerd. I discovered comedians on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was a weekly variety show on Sundays. Yeah. So those of you who remember.
Watched it. Yeah.
Yeah, no kidding. And I was 8 years old and I couldn't watch Johnny Carson, which was the other place you can see comedians. So I saw, for example, Richard Pryor in his first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. He was like 20 years old. He was so funny. He was fantastic. And I was sitting there and my father was laughing hysterically. And, you know, the audience in the Ed Sullivan Theater was laughing hysterically. And I thought, and there's also 30 million people watching this show who are laughing hysterically at this one guy who's just telling a story. And I thought, man, I want to get better at that. I want to know how that works. And from then on, I was just kind of hooked on comedy.
Oh, I remember, I mean, as a kid, when I was really young, I remember the Ed Sullivan Show. And I remember this, this one moment when I had a little black and white TV, as we all did, and I think it was Jim Morrison of the Doors, and he was on this TV screen. Ed Sullivan would just bring the most amazing talent into your living room, right?
Unbelievable.
And I remember being 4 and telling my mom, looking at it and telling my mom, I was like, "He's sexy, Mom." I didn't know what sexy was. I just thought Jim Morrison was sexy, but that was those little moments from television, from the glory days of television.
It was the glory days.
And then also growing up, I don't know about you, but the one thing that I could stay up late to watch was Saturday Night Live.
Saturday Night Live, man, talk about a great comedy brand,
Absolutely.
a great comedy entity. When we started when we started Comedy Channel and Comedy Central, that was like the only comedy thing in America. National Lampoon, which was the other one I loved, had kind of gone out of business. I mean, they were around, but their heyday was way over. So it was really Saturday Night Live who was setting the standard for good comedy in America. And certainly we got Saturday Night Live onto Comedy Central as soon as we could because we loved the show. And it was, when we started, it was huge. It was bigger than us by a long shot.
Oh, that's how you got introduced. Important. That's how I was introduced to George Carlin, to Steve Martin. I had a different story. I guess I'm a bit older than you. I look older than you, that's for sure. Midge, come on.
Well, at least you knew who Ed Sullivan was. I mean, that's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yes.
When I was a kid, and when I'm talking about 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, and I'm still into comedy. That's when the comedy albums started to become, billion sellers, starting with Bill Cosby, you should pardon the expression. And who was, that was, he had so many comedy albums. And George Carlin had the world's greatest comedy album. We played the Carlin album in my house. I have 2 younger brothers. We played that over and over to the point where we started talking like George Carlin. And my mother was like, what is with you guys? Why are you talking like that? But that's how much we loved those albums. That's how we learned about comedy. Robert Klein.
I felt when I would listen to George Carlin, there was that little voice inside of me going, yeah, he's got it. Like, yeah, his perspective on this is true, is right. And it was the rebel. There was a little bit of a rebel feel about, listening. I was, I'm listening to George Carlin, it was kind of like a little sneaky thing. But there was the beginning, the heyday, right, of bringing comedy to television and into people's living rooms. This was a time too, in the early days, with Ed Sullivan, also with the variety shows like Laugh In and things like that, where
Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour.
Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. This was when whole families were together, because I remember just watching television. It wasn't a solo sport. It was everybody after dinner, everybody had to sit around in the TV lounge, the TV room, and watch these. And
that's right.
And so there had to be an appeal as well to a wide demographic as well,
Well, not only that, but you remember in those days, and this is when I started in television in the mid 80s, there were 3 networks. And it was possible. I mean, we won't even go into how many people watched I Love Lucy have her baby on TV. I think it was like 60 million households or something. But, on any given night, 20 million, 30 million people were watching the same show. Like everybody watched the Ed Sullivan Show. You go to work the next day, and I didn't work in those days, but you go to work the next day and people are talking about it. Hey, just say, yeah, of course I saw. Of course, what'd you think? That when cable came in, I was, I guess, part of the problem. The audience really fragmented. To the point where, you couldn't really collect 20 or 30 million people for a show, unless it was. Well, I don't think it's been done lately.
And then you have some iconic shows too that were labeled, comedy sitcoms, but they crossed that barrier into, civil rights issues and gender equality and
like
homophobia and things like that that were going on. Like with All in the Family, I remember a couple episodes going, wait, this is serious what they're talking about. Like, wait. You can't have what was her name? Edith. You can't have Edith, being sexually assaulted or, die. But they were broaching like real life situations that the country was dealing with as well. In particular,
well, you're onto something that I like to talk about. So I'll mention it now. And that is, comedy is a great communication tool. I mean, I know a lot of your audience are entrepreneurs are looking to start businesses and everything else. Comedy is like humor. greases the wheels of business. I mean, it really does. And the people who really don't operate with a sense of humor are at a disadvantage, you know, because it greases the wheels. But that's in real life. Now, when you talk about a show like All in the Family, they were taking on serious subjects, and there were several shows after that did too. But with a comedy, you know, they with an overlay of comedy, so people actually listen to it who wouldn't otherwise listen to a lecture on, you know, what it's like to be a woman and be sexually assaulted. So comedy brought so much understanding to the world, I think, through those shows, and also through, you know, comedians. And we can name some of the comedians who were breakthrough women comedians who really brought the women's experience to America through a comic lens, and it made a lot more sense that way.
Well, a perfect example, and someone that I've worked with, I produced a radio show for Roseanne Barr several years ago. And by the way, if I can produce Roseanne Barr, I can do anything.
I admire you from what I know of the situation.
Yes. Extremely talented human being. Like every single bone in her body is funny. Do you know what I'm saying? She's a genius. She's also got like 5 or 6 signs in Scorpio, which that's how we connected too, because I got 5 planets in Scorpio, and we're like, oh my God, you're a Scorpio. Oh, the brain. But the whole Roseanne show, the whole stand-up career that she had before even the Roseanne show, and this idea of a bit of a self-deprecating kind of character, but really like saying it how it is. And it wasn't about being, this pretty, beautiful little package. It was raw, and she connected with millions and millions of women who were like her, who were in that same situation in life. And then she became, famous and a star and, and all of that. But the power of Roseanne and the Roseanne show, and then also like you were, Ellen DeGeneres as well. I remember, do you remember that time, that moment in human history when we knew that she was going to be coming out on the show, and all hell was breaking loose. Advertisers were threatening to pull bomb threats. There were bomb threats on the soundstage at the Ellen show. Her personal security. I mean, it was like the world was going to end just because Ellen was going to come out as being gay on the show. Do you remember that moment in time? I felt like I was.
I remember the moment. I vaguely remember some of what you're talking about. I don't remember the bomb threat so much, but the advertisers pulling out, that was a big deal. I guess being bombed is worse, but when you're in the business, you think, oh man, we'll take the bombing, but please, Procter & Gamble, don't leave. Ellen, that was, but there's so many shows you can cite now that were breakthrough shows that really made the network sweat. And that, you talk about, I said cable fragmented the audience, but the other thing that cable brought that the networks really never got to effectively was getting over this whole, we're beholden to advertisers. We have to throw out a wide net. You can't say any word. You can't say anything. You can't say bad words. You can't talk about abortions they did eventually a little bit, but on the whole, if you wanted to see Robin Williams perform the way he really performed in a club, uncut, uncensored, he went to HBO. That was the only game in town when they showed up. And I was working at HBO in those days. And, that was a breakthrough in television. The fact that you could put basically anything you wanted, any movie you wanted, any performer, anything went on HBO. And that was part of its appeal. And it really.
And HBO was the only game in town there for a bit as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's true. HBO, they were around since like 76 when they went up on the satellite in 78. But in the early 80s, when they were really starting to rocket ahead, you also had A&E coming up, ESPN showed up. I mean, it was just at the time when some of these channels, were starting to show up. There were there to take chances, because what else could they do? Plus, of course, they weren't regulated by the FCC, which the networks were.
Right.
That's the other reason they get away with doing anything they wanted. But that was a very important breakthrough. And that was why HBO became the place for comedy on TV as quickly as it did.
Because they had that freedom. And anybody that knows, stand-up comedy, or even skit comedy, but especially with stand-up comedy, that it's going to offend someone. I mean, it can, not everybody, but something that's going to be said could possibly offend someone. And when you have that platform to be able to be, as creative as possible, then that gives you a whole lot of freedom. And then that has a huge value for the audience, because they're actually seeing somebody at their craft, right? They're seeing That's Chris right. Rock, not PG, but able to really just let it go and be who he is and his greatness as well.
Right. Lately, there's been a little, pushback against that, as you know.
Yes. Which
scares me to death. I mean, a friend of mine, Vinny Favali, and I did a podcast series, a short series, about 20 episodes, also called Constant Comedy, where we interviewed people from the early days of Comedy Channel, because it was the 30th anniversary last year of Comedy Central. And the single biggest thing that came up, especially among the stand-up comics, was we are scared to death about what's going to happen to stand-up comedy if audiences keep standing up saying that's offensive, you can't talk about that, and walking out of the room before you even finish saying anything. All I can say is I hope it swings back, because some comedians are really getting to the point where they're afraid of working live. Right.
And because of the scrutiny that they have, and the media, there's a weird dance that we have, that society has in general, with people that we hold up high, and a lot of times we like to see them fall. What do they say? If it bleeds, it leads type thing, right? It's you sell more papers, or not. That's an old analogy, but you get more views when it's a negative story instead of something that's a positive story. We know that as we do. But let's talk about the history, because we just talked about the whole history sort of comedy in television, and really, I mean, creating a whole channel based on comedy at the time probably too was a bit risky, because it had never, it hadn't been done before. But can you want to talk about the origin of, Comedy Channel, but before that was called the Comedy Channel, which makes good sense.
When we started it, when we started it, we named it the Comedy Channel because, like, what else do you call a comedy channel? And in those days, everybody was naming it like, ESPN was really the Entertainment and Sports Network. So they were naming themselves what they were, Arts and Entertainment Network. So Comedy Channel was easy. I started this out by saying I was a comedy nerd, and that lasted right through college. I mean, I was just fascinated with comedy. When I got to college, I was hanging out with guys who were really funny, and who some of them went on to be great comedy writers and producers, including the producers of Ellen, Neil Warrens and Carol Black, and a friend of mine, Mike Whitehorn, who did King of Queens. These guys were really funny, and we had so much fun together. And just before we graduated, Mike said to me, hey, a bunch of us are going out to LA. We're going to be writers. And I said, never happened. Because my parents used to tell me, like, either you're a lawyer, you're a doctor, an accountant, or you're a failure, and there was no way you could make a living in the entertainment business. That just wasn't done. And it really, they had made me believe it was impossible. And my friend said, no, we're going to go out there. We'll get jobs as whatever, and then we'll become writers. And of course they did. I became an economist. That was my major in college. I got a job out of college as an economist in a consulting firm in Washington. I worked my butt off. And people say, oh man, you love comedy. You went into economics, but I had a great time as an economist. I got to tell you, I was working with the smartest people I've ever worked with. And I was at my all-time smartest in those days. I was like 25 years old. It's been downhill since then, let me tell you. But I was really smart, solving tough problems and stuff. But at the end of the day, I guess I was there for a few years, and I didn't want to be an economist for my entire life. And so I decided to do something I call changing the channel, which I've done several times in my life, which is like, okay, let's just change everything. Let's just do something unexpected. And maybe this doesn't sound like a big deal, but for me, it was going back to school. So I went to graduate school in business thinking, okay, I'm going to come out and I'm going to get a job in television or in film. Turns out I didn't have to go to business school to do that, but nobody told me at the time. But I got involved with something there because I asked, like, where do the creative kids hang out? And they said, well, they do this thing called the Follies, which is a musical comedy satirical review. And I went down there to the meeting, and there were people who had been on Broadway. There were people, professional choreographers, dancers. These people were all now in business school trying to get to Wall Street. And I was trying to go the other way, get into the entertainment business. Anyway, we had a great time putting on those shows. They were really professional. Second year, I was the head writer for the show. And it reminded me how much I loved comedy because I wrote the comedy. I'd written comedy before, in high school and college. I loved writing sketch comedy. And that was kind of when I decided, how come if I want to get a job out there in television land, how come there's no comedy network? Because that's kind of like where I'd really like to work, is at an all comedy network. I mean, I really loved comedy. I wasn't a comedian. Let's get that straight.
Right.
I never saw myself as a performer. I did some when I was in college, but that wasn't a thing. I wanted to be involved in the comedy business. So I got my first job out of school. It was at CBS. And it was really, it was a gigantic corporation. It was like working at the post office. I wasn't anywhere near comedy, let alone programming, let alone the product, A friend of mine called me up from HBO, which was new then. HBO was kind of like Netflix is now, it was like the hot happening place to be and work and watch. And he said, hey, they're looking for somebody here at HBO to do subscriber forecasting. And you're the only guy I know who knows anything about economic modeling.
Economics, yeah.
And I said, yeah, okay. So I went over, interviewed for the job, got it. And there I am doing econometric forecasting at HBO, which, believe me, was the last thing I wanted to do at HBO. But
it got you in.
There were 700 people. I could talk to people in the elevator who were doing comedy and programming and it was an exciting place to be, even though I was nowhere near that stuff. So I did the best job I could. I didn't phone it in. I did the best job I could on the assumption that if I did a good job, somebody'd notice me and maybe I'd move closer to programming. And that's kind of what happened. I spent 2 years doing forecasting, and I got around the company and talked to a lot of people, and ultimately ended up, and they were putting together a new business development department. And they had a specific new television channel they wanted to try, and it failed about a week after I got there. It was a terrible idea and a terrible everything. So naturally I said, hey, we should do a comedy network. But nobody really said, that sounds like a good idea. They just said, yeah, it probably wouldn't work. So I was young, and I was kind of, without fear for some reason, because I look back on this day, I decided I would go and talk to the head of HBO programming about my idea for a comedy network. Now, by then, let me just make it clear, I had been thinking about a comedy network for a long time. And I had talked to a lot of people about it who basically raised objections. They'd say, oh, nobody could ever do a comedy network. And I'd say, why not? Too expensive. So I'd go back and say, all right, now how are we going to do this on the cheap if that's the objection? And the lesson I learned there is when you have an idea, or when you're an entrepreneur, in my case, an intrapreneur, I was doing it inside a company, talk to everybody about your idea, because you will get such great feedback. Your instinct is, hey, man, I'm going to keep this a secret because I don't want anybody to steal my idea. But that's wrong. Nobody's going to steal your idea. I mean, that's always a long shot. Number one. Number two, you're going to end up with competition anyway. So get over it.
Right.
Anyway, so by that time, I really had a good feel for what I thought this comedy channel could be and what it could do and how it would work. And I'd done financials in my head and on paper a little bit. So I said, I'm going to go see the head of programming at HBO. Her name was Bridget. Now, she was at the top of the org chart. I was at the bottom of the org chart. So that was a scary moment for me. But she agreed to see me. I went in and I said, Bridget, I really think HBO, should do a 24/7 all comedy network. And she said, stop right there. That's a terrible idea. And I'm going to tell you why. She spent 15 minutes telling me why it was a terrible idea. And she said things I hadn't even considered, which even at the time sounded kind of wacky. She said, no A-list comedian would be on an all comedy network.
Wow.
She said, do you think Billy Crystal would be on? No. Do you think Robin Williams? She kept saying this over and over. And I talk about this in the book. And, so I'm sitting there having this truckload of ice cold water poured all over my idea, and she gave me 100 reasons. Then she said, thanks for coming in. You obviously don't know anything about television. See you around the quad. And I left without having said more than like 15 words. And I felt bad. But by the time I got to the elevator, I realized she was wrong, that somebody was going to start a comedy network. And why shouldn't it be me? And that was my first experience, is really kind of getting it out there.
And did she get fired or something? Did she leave? And then, how did your concept, your idea, how did it move forward? Did you just go to somebody else or revamped how you pitched it, or?
I kept working on it, is a short story. And this was literally maybe a month or two later. It wasn't that far after I spoken to Bridget. I was really figuring, okay, if HBO is not going to start a comedy network, I'm either going to have to do it on my own, and that's going to cost a lot of money, or I'm going to have to take it to another place, like, Viacom, they had MTV, maybe they would do it, maybe Paramount would do it, maybe, I just went down the list. And I was going to send my resume and attach my idea for the comedy network in the hopes that I get a job and all that kind of stuff. So I'm working on this, and I'm working on my resume and everything. And my boss's boss walks in and says, what are you working on? You don't have that much to do. And I said, yeah, I have this idea. And he says, let me see. And he takes a look at it. He goes, this is great, Art. He says, we ought to take this to I want the chairman of HBO to see this. I said, wow, the chairman of HBO. I mean, Bridget was up here. The chairman was God. Right. Michael Fuchs was the chairman of HBO. He had been named 2 weeks earlier by Time magazine as the most powerful man in Hollywood.
Yep.
This guy, if I got into the elevator with this guy by accident, I'd break into a cold sweat, because he could snap his fingers and say, okay, whoever you are, you will never work in the business again. Right. And that would be the end of you. That's how powerful this guy was. So I said, okay, Larry, my boss was named Larry. I said, okay, yeah, that'd be great. See Michael. He goes, come on, let's go. I said, right now I got, I got nothing. I got no presentation materials. I got nothing. He said, come on, we're just going to go tell him about it. So I went in and I had to do it on the spot. And Michael said, well, what do you got? He came in here without an appointment. He's already a little pissed off.
All right.
This better be good. So I pitched my little heart out. And I think two things got me through to the point where Michael said, wow, that sounds interesting. Let's pursue it. One was passion. And people don't talk about passion in pitching a lot, but man, that is the most important thing. I mean, it's got to be coming out of your eyes and ears, and you got to be, really excited about it. Because, hey, if you're not excited about it, why do you expect anybody else to be excited about it? Even if you are and you're kind of keeping it, I just want to be calm about it. No, man, they want to see you jumping up and down. Second was vision. Vision is an important part of any new business, because you want to think about what your new business or the business idea is going to do to change the world if it's successful in 10 years. How is that going to change things? And I said to Michael, Michael, in 10 years, if this thing works, we are going to be the center of the comedy universe. Now, at that time, National Lampoon had come and gone. Saturday Night Live was actually in a little bit of a slump. This is the 80s.
Yeah.
And stand-up comedy was picking up some steam. So Michael saw an opportunity, and he loved comedy. He was the guy who put the comedy specials on HBO, Billy Crystal, George Carlin, all those guys, Robin Williams. So that was when he said, yeah, let's explore it. He teamed me up with the head of comedy at HBO, a guy named Stu Smiley. That's his actual name. And Stu had been in the comedy business for 10 years. First thing he said to me, before he even said hello, what do you know about comedy? That's what he said. What do you know about comedy? And my answer was nothing. I like it. I'm a fan. Basically, here's a guy who had worked in the business for 10 years, being teamed up with a guy who was in finance or something. That was me.
Down in the boiler room.
And he used to, even after that, it was like, oh, there he is, the guy with the big idea. I was not readily accepted into the comedy club, the group of people who consider themselves professional comedians or professionals in the business. And believe me, Stu wasn't taking me under his wing. It wasn't like that at all. But we figured it out. We put together our plan. I gave a presentation at top management, including Michael, including Bridget. And we got the go-ahead. Michael said, I love it. I want to launch it in 6 months. I was figuring I'd have 2 years. Yeah, right. But he wanted it up. So that's what we did.
And the rest is history. And
with one exception, and I want to point this out. I subtitled my book, How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. Now, I didn't really lose my sense of humor, but I wanted to tell people that Comedy Channel was not a success right out of the box, nor was comedy, when we changed to Comedy Central. This thing, the first year was such a failure. We were panned by the press. And actually, the subtitle comes from when Michael Fuchs, 3 months after we launched, called me in. And he said, Art, it took a Comedy Channel to get me to lose my sense of humor because we were a disaster. It was failing. I went to work every day thinking, okay, I'm going to get fired today. They're going to turn off the channel today. And that's what the first year was like.
Wow. How did it turn around?
Well, actually, interestingly, 6 months after we launched, we got competition. And I mentioned that earlier, whoever you are, whatever you're doing, competition will show up when it's least expected. I figured it was so hard to get people to do a comedy channel. Everybody thought it was such a stupid idea for a long time that nobody would start another one. The day after we made the announcement that HBO was going to start a comedy channel, the very next day, MTV Networks puts out a press release saying, we are going to start a comedy channel as well, and we're calling it Ha. Now, they hadn't been working on a comedy channel for any period of time. It was called Ha, the Comedy Network. And I didn't think it was such a great name, but 6 months after we launched, they launched. And they were mostly sitcoms, and they said they were comedy for people from 5 to 95. We were kind of going for edgy, younger, hipper comedy, right? So right off the bat, we're doing this, but it's competition. We're competing for advertisers and audience and distribution and talent and everything.
All right.
And we're killing each other. The newspapers loved it. The magazines loved it. They called it the Comedy Wars. It was a big deal. They couldn't wait to see us destroy each other. So 6 months after we launched, I get a phone call. They're merging the channels, which to me was like the worst possible news because I thought we were winning the Comedy Wars. I thought we had the better channel. We were starting to get an audience, starting to pick up a little steam. And you know something? Let me tell you about competition. It makes you better. It really makes you better. It helped us define who we were because that's who we weren't. And we had to fight harder. And we had to fight in the trenches, every day. And we lost a lot of battles. We tried to get Saturday Night Live. They showed up and started bidding on it, and they won. They spent more money on it than we could even afford. And they put on Saturday Night Live. Anyway, at the end of 6 months, they merged the channels. They took me and the head of programming from Ha, a guy named Mike Klinghoffer. They threw us in a room. They said, you guys figure out what the new channel is, what the programming is, what it's going to be all about. And by the way, you can't call it Ha or the Comedy Channel because that would mean somebody won the war.
Right.
And we can't have that. So you got to rename it. So the second hardest thing after starting a comedy network was merging two comedy networks. That, to me, it was almost harder. It was almost harder. And the heavy betting among the top management who had done this deal, Michael and the head of Viacom, MTV networks, was that the channel was not going to make it through the year. They didn't say that at the time, but they really didn't expect it to last. They thought the thing was going to be a failure. But we were hell-bent, Mike and his team and my team that I brought, we were hell-bent on making sure there was a comedy network in the world. We shared that vision and we made it work.
And then how did the name Comedy Central come up?
Now, that's a great story. And I do tell the story in a book because it's so funny.
And we can wait, before we say it, there'll be a link in the show notes for people to get Art Bell's book. It's the Constant Comedy, How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. So we'll make sure that people have that, the link so they can get the book. And you don't have to say too much because we do want people to go out and get the book. But
there's lots of stories in this book.
Okay. Yeah. Because the name, I mean, I'm just following
you.
But
the name is a fascinating thing. Now, probably everybody knows that there are companies, their whole raison d'etre is that they're experts in naming things, because naming things is hard. And I kept saying, man, what else are you going to call this thing besides Comedy Channel? And such a stupid name. But we had to do it. So we hire one of these naming companies, and they talk to us about the channel. We told them what our vision was. They come back with a presentation. They say, okay, we've got some ideas for what you should name the channel. First idea, big. And now there's about 15 of us in the room and we're like, big? What do you mean big? And they said, it says that, it's bold, it's big, it's big. No, what else you got? Second, Acme. I said, Acme?
Like the Roadrunner and the Coyote?
Acme. That's what I said. I said, I get the connection to Roadrunner and Coyote. So at least that, unlike big, is connected to comedy. But can you get any closer to comedy? He says, well, look, you guys told us you wanted to be the center of the comedy universe. You wanted to be Comedy Central, but that's too on the nose. We would never name it Comedy Central.
Oh my God.
And I raised my hand. I said, why wouldn't you name it Comedy Central? He said, because what if you want to, do other stuff? I said, what, like girls lacrosse? I mean, what are we going to do? We are a comedy network. But we walked out of there having paid zillions of dollars to these guys, not really, and said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to test the names they gave us. They gave us 4 or 5 names. And the research guys were going to put it out, get a quick response on which ones they like better. Acme, big, the other ones. And the head of research said, we need one more name because there's not enough names here. I said, hey, you know what? Throw in Comedy Central. That came up, but they'd say it would never work. So the research comes back in 3 days. The guy walks in my office and says, 97% of the people said they want a channel called Comedy Central. The other things didn't even rate. And I said, oh my gosh, how are we going to tell this company that happened? But that's what we did. We just,
I love that story. I love that story.
Hey, you got to take control of the situation, man. And
Acme.
Comedy Central,
it sounds like acne.
By the way, I tell some of these stories in the book, and I try not to insult these people. They're very smart and they've done brilliant work before, during, and after. But, sometimes you tell these stories because that's how these things happen. And I wanted to give in my memoir, and it's a memoir, so it's from my point of view. I really wanted to give a feel for what it's like to be in the middle of a business, trying to make decisions. Like when you name a channel, you're making a big decision. I mean, that's going to direct things for a long time in a lot of different ways. And I wanted to really tell what that whole process was like and make it fun and funny.
I love it. I love that story. Well, and it's the same, it's the same too, when so much of your history through this whole process, people who are starting their own business, their own coaching or their own consulting can relate to as well. Because also, number one, you stuck with your idea as well. You said, you know what, this is something that I know is going to be good. You were passionate about it. And you, even working at the beginning, like in some department, some level in HBO, knowing that once you're in there, there may be somebody that you could one day talk to, that get to know. Again, that optimism, right, that you had is really important. But also the name, the branding is really important, because you could be the best thing since sliced bread. You could be the most amazing consultant coach. You could fix something like that. And if people are not attracted to your name, your brand, then they're not going to, they're not going to find out about you.
That's exactly right. And you're leaving out one important group who needs a good name and a good tagline or brand or whatever you want to call it. And I tell some stories about our taglines too. And that's the people who work there. If you name yourself Comedy Central, you kind of took on a big responsibility there, didn't you? Because, you're really aspiring to be something in the comedy world. And at that time, believe me, we weren't. We were, I went to work every day thinking, what can we do less of that's not working? What can we do more of that's working? Because we were hanging by our fingernails for the longest time after the merger too, trying to determine who we were, what we are. I tell the story of one of the taglines that we took on early on, the first one, and it was, we're all going to die, watch Comedy Central. And we love that tagline. We love that tagline. Everybody, and the reason we love that tagline is because, like, I asked my father what he thought of it. He said, it's horrible. You can't say that. And then I asked my younger brother, who was like 22, and he said, that's the funniest thing I ever heard. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to separate out the people who weren't going to like the channel. We wanted those young, we wanted that, 18 to 34 cohort. And that's what you got to do. You got to be aspirational in your name, aspirational in how you talk about yourself, aspirational in your taglines. And all of that is very important, as important as our programming.
And focus on your audience, right? Focus on your key audience. If your key clientele or customers, if you want to draw in a particular demographic, then target that demographic, right? For me, majority of my clients are women that are in, 40, 50, 60 even. So in that 40 to 60, and that's usually women at that point, maybe if they've had kids, they've gone to, university, or they're on their way, and they have more disposable income at that time. But also that's my strong connection with women. So that's my audience. But when you started, when you started this whole thing, that vision of knowing who you want to attract and being really good at it, that's where all the success starts rolling in, right? It does. I know there was some pitfalls in there as well.
Yeah. No, listen, even from the beginning, and I know audience research sometimes gets a bad name. It's portrayed on television as kind of goofy, focus groups and all that kind of stuff. You've got to know your audience, because you are not, whoever you are, certainly in television, you are not your audience. It's just, it doesn't work out that way, because it's a big country, and you got to know all about what those people are thinking about comedy, about television, how they use it, what they think about comedy, what it means for them in their lives. We had to learn all of that stuff from scratch. We had to find out. I loved focus groups because people would put into words things that we couldn't figure out how to describe, So know the group you're trying to sell to is so important. Research. I used to say, running a television channel without doing research is like flying a plane with a blindfold on. It's just, how can you do it?
Right. Well, you got to get that. You do have to get that feedback. And I think when I lived in LA, I was in part of a couple different focus groups. They call you into the studio and you watch some little thing, and then you fill out the cards and you have lunch or something. I don't know. It was a nice experience. But yeah, you're right, because you have to get that feedback. They'll also notice things. They'll also see something. They'll go, wait a second. In that first scene, they're wearing, this thing. And then I noticed, they'll pick up on stuff that you'll never see. Because also, just like people who have their own business, sometimes we're too deep inside it that we need that aerial shot, or, that drone shot of someone else looking in and going,
absolutely.
But
not only that,
yeah,
you want to be able to describe your consumer, your audience, your target audience, down to the minutest detail. You really want to know what that person or people, what those people are like, what their lifestyle is like, what your product is going to do for them, how it's going to affect their lives or change their lives. You got to know all that. You can't just make it up. You can't make it up. So it's very, very important. Very important.
And also, I just like the tip of, using humor. Look at like when you look at some of the influencers as well that are on social media, so much of it is based on humor. Celeste Barber here in Australia. I mean, her little comparisons, showing a supermodel doing something weird and then her reenactment of it. And it's brilliant. It's humor gets us through the tough times.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Absolutely.
Look way back when they did the silent films and Charlie Chaplin and the other gentleman who
Buster Keaton.
The audience was going through freaking hell. There was so much, economic disparity and trouble, and they went to the cinema to get relief, to laugh, and to forget about their problems for a moment. And throughout history, that's what we've done. We did going to the cabarets, going to vaudeville, going to the silent movies, and then going now to going to some concerts and things, but then having Comedy Central or Saturday Night Live come into our homes and give us a little bit of a break from reality.
No, it's very important. One thing that you mentioned, though, that I want to circle back to was my optimism. And if you said to my wife, boy, your husband, well, he must have been so optimistic, she would start laughing like hysterically, because I am not optimistic by nature. But you have to push through. And one of the ways I push through, people say, how'd you get through it? You look for signs of success, little tiny signs of success, anything. And you grab onto that and you hold on to it like crazy. The first sign of success that came into us was Mystery Science Theater 3000. It came, that show? Yeah. It came to us before we launched Comedy Channel. We got an envelope in the mail. There was a tape and there was a note. We hear you guys are starting a comedy channel. Is this something that you would be interested in? So we put in the thing, and it's, of course, brilliant. They had been producing Mystery Science Theater 3000 at a tiny station in Minneapolis. We flew out there the next day, and I held on to that. Not only did we make it our first kind of hit, but, I held on to the fact that if we're going to be a comedy network, great comedy's got to come to us. We can't be everywhere.
Yes.
And there it was. There was the first example of great comedy that would not have gone on HBO or CBS or NBC or, any of the channels. Thank goodness we were there. That's how people said it. Thankfully, you were there to put on MST 3000 and ultimately South Park and The Daily Show and Chris Rock, all of those things. They needed a home, and that's what kept me going.
Oh, I forgot about South Park. Holy moly. You know how many people the lives that people have changed, the lives that have changed due to Comedy Central?
Yeah. And I am not going to take credit for South Park. I was on my way. I was leaving at the time South Park was coming in. So, and the reason I was leaving
there was that whole, because also the thing about, Comedy Central and a channel dedicated to comedy was that it opened it up. So it wasn't just about comedy movies like the National Lampoon type things, or stand-up comic routines, right? Which, a concert and you film it. You brought in animation, and that opened up a whole big industry. And I remember there was a time where everyone was trying to get that, that next animated comedy out, from South Park to Family Guy. People were throwing out. I even got approached I wrote through a cartoon character for America Online way back, and they were talking about taking the cartoon character and making it into a animated comedy thing. It was not the right time and too much craziness, but it was that hot time. It was that moment of we need to create. And it started a whole cottage industry. I mean, the animated comedies just blew up.
Yeah, right. No, it was Comedy Central and Comedy Channel, especially the early days. I mentioned I did a podcast, talking to some of the people who were there in the early days. For some of those people, it was their first job in comedy, and that or in entertainment. It was an explosion of creativity for everybody who was there. Even though we weren't, a success out of the box, it was an explosion of creativity. People could do what they want. And that's really what, that was my vision. That was my hope for Comedy Central, that it would be a place where people could try things and do crazy things and really innovate in comedy. And I think it's lived up to that. I'm pleased to say.
What a beautiful way to work too, to be able to be as creative as your mind can handle, and to see what works and to start something and to see it grow. That's a beautiful feel. And I'm applying that to our entrepreneurs right now as well, who are starting their own coaching business. I hope wonderful listeners and viewers on YouTube got something out of the show. I know I did. I'm inspired. I'm also going to tap into, because you know what? Because when I work with people, the comment that they get is, of course, oh my goodness, I learned so much about podcasting or radio or creating a YouTube channel. But what they say, and this is the biggest compliment to me, is how much fun they've had, how enjoyable it was. And that I was, if they say that I was funny or something like that, great, but that they had fun. And I'm going to do that I'm putting more of that out there. Because I'm inspired by you, Art Bell. I'm gonna do a little bit more of that and get it out there. Because the seriousness, the whole thing, the whole pitch and sales thing, I'm gonna embrace my inner comedian a little bit more.
Good for you. I'm sure it'll work.
You are welcome back anytime on Out of the Box.
Oh, thank you. I'd love to come back. Thank you.
I loved our conversation, and I want everybody to check out the book by my guest today, Art Bell. It is called Constant Comedy. This is a memoir from Art Bell, how I started Comedy Central and lost my sense of humor. And you can check it out. We'll have a link in the show notes so you can check out that book. And if you want more information about Art, you can go to artbellwriter.com. That's artbellwriter.com. I'll put the link to his website as well in the show notes. And as always, I want to remind you to think outside of that damn box. For more information about the podcast, go to outoftheboxwithchristine.com. For more information on me, go to christineblasdale.com. Until next time, have a beautiful day, stay safe, and love each other.